At Cottage Grove, Oregon, a group of remarkable people have come together to create buildings out of earth that teach us how to live more simply and closer to the earth. We're going to meet Michael Smith, who trained as a civil engineer, but turned instead to this more ecologically sane form of building. Ianto Evans, a Welsh landscape architect who adapted traditional European earth building, or cob, so we could stop using our houses to hide from nature. And Linda Smiley, a therapist with a special interest in sculpting sacred spaces.
The root of the word cob means a lump or rounded mass. Cob, in the sense of a building material, is primarily earth formed into a lump or a rounded mass built into a wall.
To start this process, we take soil and sand in proportions depending on the soil type that we're working on. In this case, we're using about 60% soil and 40% coarse river sand. We mix them together dry, like you'd mix concrete. We add water, and then we start stomping around in it and add straw in. And the straw is really the structural reinforcement in the cob. One of the first things that people often ask about cob is how come it doesn't wash away in the rain? And this wall is proof that it doesn't. This wall has been sitting out here. We built it last September and October, and it's been sitting uncovered in the Oregon rain for 5 months now. And this part down here is still completely dry. The part up at the top is kind of mushy. But as soon as we either get a roof over it or the sun comes out, it will dry out again and become extremely hard. Some of the cob buildings in Wales and other parts of Britain, which are right along the coast where there are real severe gale conditions, are still standing after 500 years and more. And I think that's a good indication of how long-lasting cob building can be. There are only two real key factors for keeping cob stable over the long term. And the British say you give a cob wall a good set of boots and a good hat and she'll last forever. One of the things that you need to do is get the cob wall up off the ground by putting it on some sort of a foundation. And often we just use a rock wall. In this case, we've used rounds of yew wood because we had them here convenient, and because we know that yew, if kept out of direct contact with the earth, will last about as long as cob will, which is for all effective purposes forever. The reason why I got involved originally with cob building was out of a concern for the amount of natural resources that goes into housing ourselves. I had been working with forest management down in Costa Rica and had come to the conclusion that the only hope we have to preserve what's left of the world's rainforests and other ancient forests is to drastically reduce the amount of timber that we're using in housing ourselves and for other purposes. Cob is one way that people can build themselves beautiful, comfortable homes and cut the amount of timber that goes into housing themselves by up to about 75%. So that's one of the ways that building with cob and building with natural materials can reduce the impact that human beings have on their environment. In addition, cob has extremely good thermal qualities for building, which makes it excellent for passive solar building. All of our buildings are built to capitalize as much as possible on the sun for heating, and also set up so that they don't need additional cooling. One of the things that I love about living in a cob house is the feeling that I'm surrounded by pieces of the natural world. It's sort of like sleeping outdoors under the forest. You don't have manufactured materials like plywood, synthetic carpets, toxic paints, things which not only can be damaging to human health, but are certainly in their manufacture, transportation, installation, damaging to the environment, and ultimately unsustainable. Building a cob building like this is an opportunity for creative artistic expression, in the same way that painting or sculpting or cooking or sewing or any of those crafts are. What we're developing is a system that people can use to sculpt themselves a home. And cob is such a pliable medium that you can be wild and crazy and imaginative, and work in all the little flights of fancy that you want. What we do with our buildings is create structures that feel like they've grown out of the ground, feel like if nature were to design a house for people to be in, that they might look something like this. We've drawn our inspiration for this work from so-called primitive architecture and primitive building, and also from observing how animals, non-human animals, house themselves in nature. And one of the things that is universally true is that nature does not create boxes that something then comes along and fills up. What nature does is creates forms which shelter functions, by which I mean that the spaces which animals inhabit or use in other ways in the wild, and that human beings used to live in, are designed and shaped precisely according to what went on in them. When we design a building, we don't think in terms of a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, a living room. What we think of is what people will want to be doing in that house: cooking, sleeping, talking, studying, and create a space that best surrounds that function. What you come up with when you do that is something very unlike a set of boxes stacked on top of each other. Instead, you come up with very organic, natural, flowing forms. And that's something that characterizes the cob buildings that we have been designing and building. When you talk about sustainability, one of the things that is essential is to think of where the materials that you're using come from. And in the long term, I think we need to get to a point again in our history where we can be meeting all of our essential needs from resources that are very locally available. We need to, in the long term, return to the place where we can feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, and house ourselves using materials that we can find within walking distance of where we live. One of the things that has motivated Cobb Cottage Company's research into natural building has been the idea of this kind of bioregional building, where we're gathering the knowledge to shelter ourselves entirely with materials that we can find on the sites where we're building. In this case, the prime building material in this building is earth, and none of the earth used in this building came from more than about 15 feet away from the perimeter. One of the really extraordinary things about Cobb, and one of the things that makes it so enjoyable to build with, is how easy it is. We teach workshops where we train people in a week to build themselves a Cobb home, and many of our students are people who have never built anything in their lives. Some of these people have since gone on to build themselves homes out of Cobb, and one example is a single mother with a 3-year-old daughter who took one of our workshops 2 years ago, and then spent last summer building themselves about a 500 square foot house with a loft. They did it almost entirely themselves. They got a little bit of help on carpentry and framing and roofing and things like that, but the actual wall raising is extremely easy to learn and lots of fun, and doesn't present any of the dangers that are associated with a lot of other building techniques. There's no power tools, there's no sharp saws, there's no noise. We build often in places with no electricity, and we've had children from 1-year-old up involved in the building process. I think Cobb is a way that people can learn to take back responsibility and take back control of their lives. Take it back from professional builders, designers, take it back from landlords, take it back from governmental agencies who are telling people, you can't do that. I think you need a professional, you need a degree, you need a license. And Cobb shows that that's not true, that anybody can build their own house.
One of the things that brought me to this has been the work I've done in Latin America and Africa. Worked a lot in Africa. Looking at how people build when they can't afford to transport things long distances, when there are no industrial processing techniques for creating building materials, for creating houses which reflect the tilt and spin of the earth and remind us of where we sit in the cosmos. All of these things came hard to me because I had to overcome a training as an architect. 7 years in architecture school does terrible things to the way you think about the cosmos. Gradually that's wearing away, and we're down to the point now where we've thrown away the blueprints. We don't blueprint anymore. We design on the backs of envelopes. We spend a lot of time on the site, and we change everything as we go, as the influences of the site, the materials, the people, the skills, all become apparent and reveal what the building ought to become. So we're in a place now where we're teaching intuitive building, if one can teach intuitive building. We're helping people reveal their own intuitive powers in the way that they build their houses. I think it's very important to democratize the building process. We've somehow got in a position where building, especially building houses, is controlled by men, especially large young men with noisy machines and power tools and dangerous gadgets. I want to have the option for people to have houses which are controlled by non-violent processes. I want to see houses where small children and old ladies and people who've never built before and people with one leg can all work together and build houses in a safe environment. The materials we're using in general allow that. I think what's more important than that is the attitude with which you come to the building process. And we've realized as we teach people to build with these natural materials that we're not just talking materials, we're talking about an attitude to the materials and the place and the whole sacred process of putting together a place where people are going to live. And to the point where I don't like to have rock music on the building site anymore, never mind power tools. I don't like to hear people cussing. I feel, and I would never have said this 20 years ago, I feel that that energy gets embodied into the house in subtle ways, even if they're only physical ways, that things aren't put together quite right if that energy's there. But at the same time, I think that the house doesn't feel right if that sort of thing happens. And so as we talk about steel and concrete and brick and sawn lumber and crushed gravel, we're talking about giant machines making these things and transporting them, and a level of violence that I don't really want to have incorporated into my buildings. And so increasingly when I have the chance, I choose river washed gravel rather than crushed rock. I choose round poles over sawn lumber. I'll choose to do things by hand rather than using power tools. Finally, Michael persuaded me to stop using the chainsaw on these buildings. It was really good for me. And I feel like I've come through a personal evolution in that a lot of these things I swept to one side not very long ago. I was quite happy to use nail guns and buzz saws and one thing and another in the interests of expediency and getting the job done. And now increasingly I feel that we're dealing with a sacred process and we should take our time and do it right, do it in a non-violent way. For most of us, a house means $100,000, a 30-year mortgage, doing something we don't like, usually, for 40 hours a week, for 30 years, to pay for the house. So even if you build your own house, if you go about it using conventional techniques and thoughts and materials, you end up never being able to really enjoy your house because you're too busy out making the money to pay for the gas, to drive to work, to pay for your house. What we have tried to do is shortcut the 30-year mortgage. Over the last 2 years, we've developed a system where we can train people now in a week, and I would not have believed this was possible, to do all the essential things that they need to be able to build a small building. We don't train them to be carpenters. We assume that they'll have friends or they can make arrangements with somebody who can help them to do the essential carpentry. There isn't very much in a cob house. If you know what you need to do, it's fairly easy to find somebody who can do the essential roof framing, for instance. We teach people how to do their own foundations, walls, windows, doorways, floors, and finishings in 7-day courses. Now this is very liberating because this means that lots of people who hitherto would never even dreamed of building themselves something to live in can now think about that. They don't have to go out and build a 2,500 square foot house. They can start off with something they can afford and get into it immediately and then add to it as they have the time and the money to do that. They don't have to own land. They can the amount of cash investment they're putting into this is sufficiently little that they can borrow land, lease it, make arrangements with people who do have land to build something that they can live in for a fixed period or on some sort of ground rent basis. So all that feels pretty good. On the issue of what do I really need, I think it's significant that the average size of the American house has gone up from 1946 until 1992 from 1,100 to 2,100 square feet. 1946, average size was 1,100 feet. In 1992, it was 2,100 square feet. The average size of the American family in that time has almost halved, from 4 point something to 2.5, 2.6 or 2.3, depending on who you take as an authority. So what's going on here? The family's getting smaller, the house is getting bigger. I think it's really important to point these things out, and that part of the business of dealing with your own housing is understanding these things and being able to deal with them. Deal with the fact that we're dealing increasingly with banks, insurance companies, licensing authorities, the government at all sorts of levels, and a giant hegemony, a cartel of the producers of industrial building materials. If we circumvent all of that, we can do the sorts of things that we've done here, which was to build ourselves a house for $500. It really was $500. We took $500 and put it aside and said we will spend that, and when it's done we've got a house. And at the end of it we still had something in the account.
As a counselor and therapist, I've worked with lots of people using cob as a therapeutic tool for expressing who we are, who we need to be, through shapes, symbology. And working with cob and sculpting spaces is a fun and profound, powerful way to work with personal processes. I live in a heart-shaped house, and we built this heart-shaped house and didn't even realize we were designing a heart-shaped house until we looked at the drawings and said, doesn't that look like a heart, doesn't it? And what we needed to live in more than anything else in this midlife crisis of ours was a heart-shaped house. And when people come into our house, oftentimes they'll comment that it feels like being embraced. It almost feels like sometimes living inside of a hug. I'm finding that a lot of people that I work with are people that are just missing that connection to the natural world. And working with cob sometimes brings that back for them. I've worked with people who are suffering from cancer that come to ground themselves. I work with people who are very spiritual that come and ground themselves in the earth. I had one person on a workshop say that the workshop was so intense it was like purification by earth. And it's fun to see how people change through the workshops. We had one person who took a 1-week workshop. His wife came to pick him up at the end of it, and she didn't even recognize him. She said, "Who's this lovely man?" You know, it changes people, mainly because physically you're working with your hands and your feet in the clay, and there is a bit of reflexology that goes on, and so you're massaging your whole body, and it does change attitudes a little bit. We see mixing cob and building our house as including dance and music as much as we can. So we dance in the cob, we have live musicians if we can. So creating your home is like creating an art form. In our workshops we do some design exercises to help people create and sculpt their sacred homes, sacred spaces, sacred workplaces. And one exercise we do is meditation where people go back into their childhood and they think about magic spots, sacred places that were really important to them, and what the qualities of these places were, and how they could build them in, and whether they're still important to build them into their life, or whether these qualities are still trying to happen more. We get some fascinating things that come through in terms of people's own personal processes and trying to build a house which can be a spiritual place for them to live, as well as a practical place. And sometimes people's process may mean a need to have so much structure in the building that they may have fantasies to put steel rods or cement, or try to represent the structure in their life. Or there may be, we've had situations where people have had a hard time putting a lot of windows in on the south side to bring enough light in. And through a gentle process of working with people to bring more light into their spaces, we see how people's bodies change and how their relationships change. So I believe that building a home is a little bit more than just putting up cob. It's a reflection on who you are and who you're trying to be more like. And with shape and materials and a process of working with other people, your personal process will naturally unfold. And it's very beautiful to watch.